So I'm going to get started. I've just got a couple little slides and then we'll get into it. So this is Cinematic Interactives with Animate CC, and I'm Joseph Lebrecq. As mentioned, we're going to be using a starter animation through CC libraries. And one of the really good reasons to do this is because we don't have a ton of time, right? And I wanted us to be able to work with something that was already existing, already had a timeline, is already set up, because there's a few things that I want to actually focus on for this particular workshop. And those two things, and this is probably the last time we'll see that URL, but again, don't worry, I'll make this all available afterwards if you don't have the stuff downloaded already. So we're going to be working in an HTML5 Canvas document. You could also do this inside of Flash Player as an ActionScript 3 document. And what's kind of nice about that is that you're able to do things like, you can test directly within Animate. So if you're actually like building animation and building assets and you want to be able to test really quickly, you can always start out with an ActionScript 3 document and then easily just copy those assets, copy those animations over to a different platform when you're ready to start coding, because really the main difference between any of the different document types inside of Animate, of which there are many, is that when you actually build interactivity into the thing, you're going to have to use one language or another depending upon what the platform is, of course. But all of the assets and animations should basically work the same across everything, every document type. So we're going to be looking at the virtual camera to provide a little kind of cinematic animation to the animation that already exists. This only works on the root timeline, and it enables things like zoom and pan, rotation, and if you're working in an ActionScript document, you can also apply color effects to your camera. And these can all be animated. We're also going to look at the global JavaScript feature a little bit. This allows you to define global variables inside of JavaScript. So for instance, this playAll variable, if we have that set at a global level, we can access that variable very easily throughout our entire document, and we don't have to deal with a lot of kind of parent-child scopes and things like that, because scope in JavaScript can be a pain to deal with. Right? This makes it a lot easier. We also have Canvas code snippets. So for HTML5 Canvas and for ActionScript and for WebGL documents, we have a number of code snippets. For the basic interactivity we're doing here, which is timeline interactivity, everything you need is really already built into the application. So let's get going here. And I'll pop open Animate. Ooh, there's Animate. All right. So if you have Animate open, you can always create a new document here. But again, what we're going to do is go over to the CC Libraries panel over on the side here. And you can see here's the actual starter document that I shared through the link. So this is what we're going to start with. However, I also have a JavaScript version, so a version with all the interactivity. And I have a complete version with all the interactivity and all of the virtual camera cinematic stuff. All right. But what we'll do now is go into Starter. And all you need to do, and this is kind of unique with Animate, you can share an entire Animate document through a CC library. So not just like particular assets, you can have the whole document, which is what that link goes to. So if I double click on the little icon there, we can have a look and see exactly what we have. So as I mentioned, this is already set up for us to start working with the camera and the actions, the JavaScript interactions. And you can see here that we've got a number of different layers in our timeline. And the timeline, it's not too long. Something to note is that each particular step, and the steps are 1 through 7, going over how to do French press coffee, right? So I have these little jump points. So we can grind the coffee, we can fill the little French press. We can push the thing down and so forth. And if you go into any of these, you can see that we have a lot of nested animations going on here. So I've got this all set up. So what we want to do is actually just preview this at first. And again, there's no kind of interactivity set up in here yet. And there's nothing from actually stopping the timeline. So if we go in here and let's quit out of there. And what you can do is go Control Play, or Test rather. If you choose Control Test, what it's going to do, and again, this is an HTML5 Canvas document, it's going to open it up inside Canvas, and it's going to run through all of the basic animation. So you can see how it's jumping there. It's not supposed to be jumping. That's because of the projector screen. That's not actually part of the thing. But you can see the animation and how it works. And there we go. We're at the end of the animation. It has stopped. So of course, if you go again, it just goes. So let's add some interactivity to this. To make things a little clearer, one thing that I did is actually used folders in my timeline. So if you go into your actions layer and we go to frame 1 of the actions layer, we can start actually adding some actions in here. And since we are targeting HTML5 Canvas, what we're going to be using is just basic JavaScript. So the first thing we need to do is open up our actions panel, but make sure you have frame 1 on the actions layer selected, just to keep things nice and clean. And you can see here that in the properties panel, I have selected a frame. And I'm selecting the actions layer, so we're all good. If I go to Window and go to Actions, that's going to bring up our Actions panel. And this is where you write in any sort of interactivity that you're going to be doing inside of Animate. No matter what type of document that you're creating, as long as it's interactive, then it's going to have some kind of code associated with it. So if we go in here and look under Global, I mean, you can see we don't have like anything here. There's no code whatsoever. But under Global, the first thing we want to do is click on that script thing right there. And we want to create a global script so that we can access this throughout the animation no matter where we are. And this is going to be a little Boolean, so it's going to be true or false, just called play all. And we're going to set that equal to false initially. So we got var, declaring the variable, play all, the name of the variable is reference, and then false is the value of our variable. And that's actually the only global script that we're going to put in here. When I go through and get out of there, so now you can see we're in the current frame in actions layer frame 1. And you can see that like right underneath that tab. So we know we're in the actions layer, which is where we want to put any other code. And the first thing we want to do is just say this.stop. And you can see we've got some contextual help here. You can also find this within code snippets. So if you go into your code snippets, which you'll see in a minute, there's different pieces of code where you can give commands to the playhead, tell it to stop, tell it to go to a specific frame, whatever. It's very similar if you've ever used Flash Professional before this. If you're doing stuff in ActionScript, even ActionScript 2, this is going to look really, really familiar, this part. And the concepts behind it are exactly the same. Code snippets can actually be accessed from right here in the Actions panel. And they can also be accessed from, of course, the window option up here. So code snippets. And you can see that we've got ActionScript, HTML5 Canvas, and WebGL. So here's our timeline navigation. So stop at this frame. That's exactly what we just typed in as a global variable in our global scripts. But that isn't what we want right here. What we want to do is for each one of these coffee beans, we want to add interactivity so that it jumps to that very specific step within our animation. So we're going to use these frame labels. So fill the press, number 2. We want when somebody clicks on that to jump to fill the press and to play that. We also need to go ahead and check to see whether or not we're supposed to play all of them or not. This little bean right here is going to allow that. If you click that, it's going to play through everything. So in order to make that happen, what we're going to need to do is, so let's go to step 3. So step 3, if I click on that particular object, you can see that in the properties panel, it is a button and it has the instance name of B3. I've simply named each of these buttons B1 through B7. And then this one I named something else, B0, I think. Yeah, B0 to play everything. So one of the nice things about the code snippets panel is that you're actually able to go in here and find something like click to go to frame and play. And that's exactly what we want. I'm going to tell it copy to clipboard. And then going back into my actions layer, expanding my actions panel, I can then paste that snippet in here. And you can see that the actual code snippets have a bunch of comments associated with them. So they tell you exactly how to go ahead and wire this up based on the instance name that you give particular objects. But there's actually an easier way to do this. So you'll notice that I had selected stir vigorously at B3 there. So if we go into our code snippets panel, if we don't want to mess with instance names and everything, because we have that selected, if I go to code snippets and choose that again, timeline navigation within HTML5 canvas, then if I simply click to go through frame and play and then choose this option instead, add to current frame, what happens is it does the same exact thing, except as you can see here, it actually uses the instance name of the object that I had selected. So it's a nice little shortcut to know about, especially if you're just getting into doing stuff with interactivity in Animate. So here we're saying go to and play, and I'm going to use a label for this. So I'm actually going to put in the label that's on that frame, which I believe was stir. So if you have a label on your frame, then you don't have to use a frame number to go to that frame. You can just use a frame label, and that way, if you extend or shrink any of your frames on your timeline, it doesn't matter. It's still going to go to that particular frame label. And in case you're wondering about the ins and outs of this stuff, basically it's just saying, hey, there's a button named B3 on this current scope, so this means the current scope, and we want to add an event listener of type click, so mouse click, and when that happens, invoke this function here, and Animate calls them, just a generic kind of function that it just kind of comes up with. So we could even rename this to B3 click. And then all we have to do is rename the actual function that gets called to B3 click. So now if we go through and do that, oh, we also have to, well, we can just say it, just play this here. So I'm going to go to control test. All right. So you'll notice the first thing that's happened is when we're at frame 1, we said this dot stop, which immediately stops the playhead from advancing anymore. That gives the user time to say, oh yeah, how do you stir a French press again? I don't remember. So then you can click on that and look at that. That's how you do it. That's how you stir a French press. So, and you notice the play all thing isn't in place right now because we haven't really gone through and checked for that variable yet. However, as I mentioned, I have multiple versions of this thing, right? And close that out. So if we go back in my library here, I have this coffee cinematic _JS. So this version takes that one step we did to jump to grind, and it fleshes it all out. So all the interactivity is actually in this version. And if we go and test this, we can do all sorts of stuff. If we go to 6, it goes straight to 6 where we pour the coffee. And then it goes back. And if we hit this one, it'll play everything. It'll go through the whole thing. So to see how this works, all we need to do is go back into our actions layer where we wrote all that stuff. And we can see that that same sort of piece of code, like here's the B3 code that we just went through. Go to and play stir. We've got one of those for each one of those buttons, each one of those labels. And notice way up top, we set play all equal to false, which we've already done in the global scripts. It's already false. However, we reset it whenever we jump back to this first frame because we have code on every one of the ending frames. So each time it gets to the end of one of those steps, one of those sequences, we check to see if play all, which again is a global script, a global variable, if it's false, then we want to send the playhead back to frame 1. So go to and play, go to and stop frame 1. Then we can choose another step. Like maybe we forgot how to drink coffee. So we can go back and figure that out. So you'll notice that's the same code in each and every one of these things, right? The only difference is on the last frame, we always go back and play 1. So he's really enjoying his coffee, you can tell. And if you want to see here, so this is like the last frame of this push animation. So as soon as it hits that, if play all is false, go back to the menu. So that is the completed JavaScript. So what about making this cinematic, right? What's cinematic about this? It's all very static right now. Well, what we can do is use the new virtual camera tool. And this is probably the fun part of this particular workshop because you can do all sorts of really neat stuff with the virtual camera. It's a tool that was released like November of last year inside of Animate. And what it does is it brings a virtual camera into your timeline, into your whole document that you're able to control, independent of any other animation you have going on. So you can see we've got a bunch of different kinds of animation going on, all this nested animation across our main timeline. But this actually does like a virtual camera that you can shift around and move and zoom and all sorts of neat stuff. So if you want to play in your thing, you can, but I think what I'll do is start with stir, because I like stir, just the dynamic movement of the spoon and everything. So to access the virtual camera, it's actually in the tools panel here where you access most of your tools in Animate. And if I toggle that on, you can see a number of things happen. We get a special camera layer, and this is only available on the main timeline of the document. So you can't have like a virtual camera inside of like a movie clip symbol if you know what that is. There's only one camera right now, and it exists on the main root document. So we also get this set of controls here, and we get a whole bunch of properties for the camera over here. And these are both grayed out simply because we're in an HTML5 document. And if we wanted to use the color effects, we would have to be using an ActionScript 3 document type. So we can just twirl that down, and these properties right here are just the document properties, so we don't really care for that. All we want to focus on are the camera properties, and you can see we have X and Y, so the position of the camera. We have the zoom, so it goes from like 0% way up to hundreds of percents. And then we have rotation, so rotation in degrees. You can access those properties through the properties panel, or that's what this thing is for too. It's like a visual overlay which controls those properties. So if we want to zoom in here, well, you know what? The first thing we need to do is actually create a tween, right? Or specific keyframes. So if you've ever used Flash Professional or Adobe Animate, you'll know that the way things often work are through tweens. To make it the easiest and most straightforward way possible, because we have about 7 minutes left, which should be perfect, I'm gonna go ahead and right-click on my camera layer, and I'm gonna create a motion tween for my camera. Motion tweens are the easiest type of tweens to work with, simply because you don't have to deal with keyframes yourself. You can, but no matter where you are in the timeline, if you start tweaking properties of whatever it is you're tweening, it's actually going to insert the proper keyframe for you and change the properties and so forth. So if we go in here, I'll find the first frame of stir. And now anything that I do, because my playhead is right there, if I go ahead and just zoom in a little bit, you can see how that works. And you'll notice here, you know, as I'm zooming in, that kind of yellow background is just the background of the actual document itself. So that background does not zoom because it's just the document background, it's just a color, it doesn't really matter. So what we can do, because it's a little weird, right? Seeing this kind of emerge out from the stage outlines, there's a feature up here where we can clip anything that's outside the boundaries of the stage, and that makes it a little easier to work with if you're like, you know, bothered by that stuff. I'm bothered by it. Something I used to do is actually go ahead and I would create a mask in my main timeline, just so I wouldn't have to look at all the stuff that was creeping out of the boundaries, out of my stage boundaries, because it was just like visually like difficult to focus when that happened. But luckily there's a nice little new button up there to do that for us. But you can see now my virtual camera, I can zoom in and I can rotate if I click that, right? And I can also pan. So if I want to pan the camera around, it's pretty neat. So if I wanted to have the camera actually tween and change its properties, all I need to do is go to the end here, and that's my end, and then just mess with these again. So, you know, maybe just change that a little bit, pan it like that. Maybe I'll zoom in a little more, make it a real close-up. And, you know, maybe we start out and it's not rotated yet, or it's not zoomed in yet. And these controls can be a little kludgy. So it's like, oh God, I don't know what exactly the 0 point is on my rotation. Oh crap, what am I gonna do now? You can actually, as mentioned, go in here and just tweak these things. So maybe X and Y, you just want it 0, maybe zoom, you want it to 100%, and rotation at 0%. And there we go, it's pretty much back. X went to 2, but you know, you could actually put 1 in there. I don't know why I did that, because I did put 1. I'll worry about that later. So now we're starting here, and we're going in. Oh, and it reset my rotation, but that's okay, because I can always go back in here and rotate. So now, there we go. So if I wanted to actually check out what we just did, I can test once again, and I went to stir vigorously. Let's click on that. And that wasn't the best animation. We need like a little bit of easing to make it better, because it looked too linear, right? So one of the really cool things about the virtual camera is that you can use like anything you're doing with tweens. So if you want to use the motion editor, for instance, you can just double click on there, and there's my motion. I can add an ease to this, maybe a start and stop, medium, And then test it again, and we can see that it's a bit improved. See, it's nicer, you know, it's not just like. And if I go into my CC libraries once again, I do have a completed version where I've got everything hooked up and working and beautiful. So if I center this once again, and we can go through it here, we can kind of see all the different sort of cinematic effects that I'm doing on this French press as it goes through here. And it would probably look a lot better if if we actually had the stage clipping off again. That drives me nuts. But as you saw, it's a very easy thing to deal with. Let's play all this time instead of skipping to one. And you can see the whole thing as it's meant to be. And I've got various eases on here as examples of different ways to actually do things. And you'll notice a shout out to Andy Phelps in there. When you stir it, it spills a little. Not when you stir it. When you pour it, we get a little spillage. That's for him. There you go. And yeah, so that is the basics of it. We've got about 3 minutes left. And like I said, I'm going to share the entire set of assets with everyone afterwards, including the slides and other resources. And mentioning other resources, if I can go back to my PowerPoint, we do have additional resources here. There we go. So, additional resources. We have a bunch of stuff I did for Linda in Plural site that has to do with Animate CC. So there are plenty of resources being developed, and not just myself. I mean, I've got a bunch of stuff up there on each of those sites, but there's actually, you know, others who are doing this stuff. It's not just me. For instance, Tom, who's sitting back there, he's mostly responsible for this. And then Rob, who isn't here, is involved in this as well. So a lot of AEL, what do you call it, collaboration around creating these resources in support of Animate CC. So here is contact information from myself. Of course, you should all know how to get to me, and you can always yell at whoever's in charge at the time if you don't. But are there any questions about this stuff? It's, you know, doing a workshop in like 20 or 30 minutes. It's a weird concept. So, yeah.
So in a term, I see my students once in 6 times in a term. Do you reckon I could do this in 6 hours with a group of students?
Teach like a virtual camera and some interactivity in 6 hours?
Yeah, so some of that stuff that you've done today.
I'd say so.
Yeah. In 6 hours.
Yeah, I mean, I ripped through it really fast, but you know, you could. I mean, it's real. If they have, so here's a disclaimer. If they already have experience doing other things, like going into this, like I don't know, you know, who has experience with, on what level inside of Flash Pro and now Animate CC. Like I have no idea. So I'm like, okay, well I'm just gonna do all that basic stuff, create a bunch of assets and animations, and then the 2 things that I want to showcase are, you know, the interactivity portion and the virtual camera portion, the cinematic interactive stuff you can do. And it's mostly just to, like, you know, get people ideas and everything. I mean, you could do this sort of stuff. It doesn't have to be this complex, right?
Yeah.
You could do it with like an infographic and just like zoom in and zoom out in different places. You know, have other things animate in, and I mean, there's lots of different applications for this combination of interactivity and cinematic effect. But I would say 6 hours is plenty of time to introduce both the concepts of interactivity and virtual camera. However, they would need to know how to, unless you were just giving them something like this and saying, all right, this is what we're going to do, like I just did.
Because I want to get away from making the ball bounce and things like the car moving across the screen and so on. That's very basic for my students.
If they already know how to do that stuff, or if they have the basics, they know stuff, they know what they want to do. I don't see any problem with doing this sort of thing in like 6 hours. Yeah, but again, it all depends on what they already know. And I mean, it's a combination that you don't have to go with either. You could go with, oh, I don't want to do the interactive aspects of it. I just want to, play with the camera. I've got a scene of like, you could even have the ball bouncing, like you say, like very fundamental. Let's bounce a ball, and then, okay, let's now take that bouncing ball, and let's have the camera like sweep in and then follow the ball and then go back out or something like that, Just put a new spin on sort of an older